Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Cervantes scholar Eric Graf, visiting assistant professor at the University of Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala. Eric, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Bill.
Eric, when we discussed you coming on the show, you pitched me on Cervantes and the economics of Don Quijote. And if you remember, I replied that I would probably enjoy it, but the listeners' eyes would glaze over. Instead, I asked you on to share stories from your own professional journey through higher education. And before fleeing the country in search of academic freedom, you taught at Smith College, the University of Chicago, the University of Illinois, the University of Virginia, the College of William and Mary, and Wesleyan University. Until we can persuade you to write a book about your journey, lay it out for us chronologically. You got your PhD in Spanish language and literature in 1996. What was your first stop in search of an academic position?
Well, my first stop was Smith College, which was a real eye-opener for me. Most of my career in academia was a series of awarenesses that I shouldn't have said something. And when I got to Smith, that became pretty clear. Right off the bat, they made me chair of a search. I took it very seriously. I was very naive. We had probably 400 applicants.
Wow.
It took weeks to whittle that down to a top 10. And I remember having a conversation with the chair of the department, and she said, well, yeah, we'll interview those 10, but, let's include this woman who's working here at the university, at the college. And, I was taken aback a little bit. I thought, well, okay, yeah, maybe it's just a friendly gesture, give her some experience being interviewed. And, of course, it turned out that that's who they wanted to hire.
The fix was in.
Yeah, the fix was in. And I went through the whole thing seriously. We went to the MLA convention and interviewed 10 candidates, invited 3 to campus, and we finally got around to having the vote. And I remember they pulled us all into the secretary's office one night around 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, and everyone gave their opinion of the candidates, and then we had a vote, and of course it was 9-1. And I was like, okay, well, I lost, big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, no. That's not going to do. We need 10-0.
Uh-huh.
And I think that was probably the moment I realized I wasn't going to get tenure at Smith College.
They closed ranks pretty quickly, huh?
They closed ranks, and I just refused. I was like, no, I'm not doing that. Stuck to my guns, got my one vote, and it was pretty much downhill from there.
You shared a funny story about sexual harassment training when you got there.
Right. Well, sexual harassment training was the first week, and it was just shocking to me that was necessary, that it had to be extensive, and that's where I got my first glimpse of all of these administrators, ombudspersons, basically the sort of ideological vigilantes that are really in control of higher education at this point. One of the first lessons of this training was that the term harassment needed to be pronounced that way. If you said harassment, it was actually some form of harassment. I guess that would be called a microaggression these days, right? Harassment. Well, what did harass mean to you?
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Everything is analyzed that way.
Everything, down to the last detail, pronouncing a word, yes.
I gave a guest lecture on telecom history at Smith College once, and I had never seen so much face hardware in all my life. I didn't even know it was possible to get pierced like that. Is that kind of fashion unique to Smith?
It might be. It's a very intense place, and in many ways it's a very sad experience. A lot of the women are there because they have trouble with the patriarchal society that we live in. And so, yeah, there was a lot of face metal. I remember my first class walking in to a standard Spanish 101, and a young lady in the front row had at least 20 pieces of metal in her face, bolts, nuts, staples, chains, and she promptly pulled out a can of Skull and began dipping for the remainder of the year. So that was pretty intense.
There you go. Yeah, you didn't last long there, though. In 2002, you moved on to the University of Chicago. What was that like?
University of Chicago is interesting. It's one of the places that I think still maintains some sort of reputation. They've recently come out with a pretty big statement against politically correct speech codes, that sort of thing. So It was enjoyable, but I could see that things were turning the other way. There were some very angry, committed activist intellectuals on campus and basically taking over departments that used to focus on great books.
What was the whole critical thinking cultural studies initiative all about?
Well, that's a general thing in academia. Critical studies is pretty much code for we need to turn our students into Democrats. And I remember on more than one occasion in faculty meetings that being said with no real shame. You know, the occasional chuckle, but it was honestly understood as precisely that. Critical thinking is teaching people to locate heterosexual, male, white, patriarchal, capitalist, European colonizing discourses. That just goes on. And that's an easy way to infiltrate departments and basically start to take apart reading lists and canons and traditional liberal arts education.
Next stop was William and Mary for a little while. What went on there?
William and Mary surprised me. You know, Jefferson went there. I thought it was going to be slightly more reasonable. I was actually accused of racism at William and Mary. I've gotten to the point where I tell people just to take a number and get in line. But I remember a young lady arriving late with regularity, and I gave her a little grief about it in class one day, and the next thing I knew, I was called into the chair's office and accused of racism. So you can't win for losing.
For those faculty who haven't bought into the political correctness movement, are they walking on eggshells all the time?
Yeah, well, to be totally honest, in 20 years, I only met one young man who was middle of the road or right of center, and he was an economist, right? Jim Miller at Smith College. He still teaches there. I don't know how he does it, but I never met anyone else who was not on board in one way or another. I assume people learn to toe the line just to preserve their chances at tenure, but I really didn't meet any. So, but I'm in the humanities. I'm not saying there isn't a physicist or two somewhere, but I really never saw him.
But no intellectual diversity at all in the humanities side?
No, really none. To their credit, they'll listen to you, and I got into a lot of arguments, and what didn't kill me made me stronger, so I appreciate the experience. I wouldn't be where I am now without them. But no, there's no intellectual diversity, and in fact, it's shocking the degree to which academia has devolved into actual activism, social activism. You know, they offer courses at the University of Illinois on community, it's called community-based learning. And so they're taking students out into the community, placing them in volunteer organizations with leftist tendencies and, teaching immigrants how to get a driver's license, how to vote, that sort of thing. So it's a real proactive process that leaves traditional academia in the dust.
Your last stop before leaving the country was Wesleyan University in 2012. You taught Spanish there?
I did. I taught Spanish. And I remember the first day of my intermediate Spanish course, which, should be all about an early brush with the subjunctive, some conversational advancements. And I was in front of the class. We had about, I'd say, 25 students. And I opened the textbook, and of course, the entire book is structured according to a hard left agenda. There's chapters on saving the earth. There's chapters on fair housing. There's chapters on lots of poetry. You have a lot to work with in Latin American literature with Marxist tradition there that's very strong. So the first poem of the text was Rigoberta Menchú, her poem, Mi Tierra, My Land. Rigoberta Menchú is a Nobel Peace Laureate from Guatemala, very leftist. I believe she was exposed for plagiarism or just making stories up at some point. But, you open the textbook, you think it's about Spanish language, and it turns into indoctrination. So I remember just saying, I was looking down at the textbook, and I remember saying, is it me, or is this just another Marxist indoctrination course?
And that was the end of the road for you in the U.S.
That was pretty much the end of the road. I remember looking up, and all students' mouths were wide open. And then, of course, some wise guy in the back of the room said, all right. He saw something that I didn't. And of course, the great irony was later that afternoon, I found out that the author of the textbook was my boss.
That was the end of that.
So that was the end of that.
Eric, several societal forces seem to be colliding on college campuses, creating a strange kind of cultural schizophrenia. You know, on the one hand, overprotected snowflake teenagers are being sent off to college by their helicopter parents into the control of a democracy that has even more power over students' lives than it did back in the en loco parentis days of the 50s and 60s. You know, on the other hand, millennials seem to be experts at binge drinking and casual Tinder hookups and are being offered official sex week courses on subjects like bondage and how to arrange a menage a trois. You've been on the front lines of college campuses for 20 years. How are these teenagers making sense of all this?
I don't know. I don't see how they can. I mean, there's no other place to go. There's no counter discourse. There's no one offering critique of what's being put on their plate. And the pressure is enormous. I describe it as almost a Maoist tendency to enforce points of view and language. It's so strong that I just don't see how that happens. You know, fortunately, there's the internet. There's places for them to go to encounter this other discourse. And I'm not convinced all students are buying it. A lot of them that I've met realize that they need to write certain types of papers. They need to ask certain types of questions and behave in a certain way in class in order to get an A.
They have to conform.
They fear for their grades. And with grade inflation since the 60s, that's a huge piece of pressure right there, right? If you don't graduate with a 98 average, you're in big trouble.
You finally decided to leave the country and settled into a faculty position at the University of Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala, a very unique place. Tell us a bit about it.
Well, it's a wonderful place. When I got here, I remember walking around the campus. They have a bronze frieze of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
Ayn Rand, I mean, she's a persona non grata on most college campuses.
Right. Well, when I saw it, I cried. I was visibly moved. Some of the people who were giving me the tour were worried, what's wrong. And I'm a Texan, and I just couldn't believe that this secular, economics-based libertarian university existed and that I had to come all the way to Guatemala to find it. So, yeah, it's an astonishing place. There's an auditorium to Milton Friedman. There's the Hayek auditorium. It's really an interesting place.
But you've been focusing on your first love, which is Spanish literature there.
Right. It's an irony that I had to come to a business-oriented professional school to actually be able to enjoy teaching what I teach. But I'm a big fish in a small pond, I guess. I'm their Cervantes specialist, and I get to teach this course in terms of Cervantes as a sort of pre-classical liberal thinker, which I honestly believe he was.
So reflecting back on your 20-year journey through academia and all the universities you taught at along the way, what do you see that's happening to the curriculum?
The curriculum is being denuded of classical great books, important texts that are provocative and would allow for some creative discourse and serious banter about important issues. It's being turned into a review of Marxist political ideology and activism, and to the degree that any of those great texts are taught, they're usually held up as examples of oppression of some sort. It's an oppression racket, basically. And when you come across colleagues who have such a distorted view of those texts. I remember when at my 10-year celebration at the University of Illinois, they gave us money to purchase a book for the library, and I offered them Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the Friedman edition. And at the cocktail party, I had a colleague in the Italian department sort of strolling along the exhibit. When we got to my book, he paused, he looked at it, and then he said, "Wow, you are a fascist."
Whoa.
If Hayek is a fascist, then I don't know how anybody can have a conversation. We're so off in the deep end that there's really not much left to be said.
Eric, you've said that humor is the new aggression. What did you mean by that?
If you are humorous, if you so much as smile or giggle, that's viewed with suspect. I find most academics have a Hobbesian or a Platonic view of humor as being a microaggression by default. And that's really sad. It hurts the culture. It makes the institution monological and grim and disturbed at all times and ready to be disturbed and take offense. So I'm a Cervantes scholar. I think humor is a big way around this impasse.
What role does the inculcation of guilt play in controlling students?
I think that's a huge factor. You hire in terms of diversity now, you're attempting to bring in faculty from the world over. You could bring somebody in from Ecuador or Ethiopia and start paying them, $60,000, $70,000 a year, give them permanent lifetime employment. And I think the guilt factor really plays a huge role. I mean, they're looking back at their countries of origin and they see people working for, dollars a day. Mm. Nothing like tenure. There's no tenure at my university. I don't think that concept exists outside of, maybe Western Europe and the United States. It's a difficult contrast for people like that. I think that guilt is one of the big motors that people don't really think about. You hear the constant recognition that there's an ideological problem on campuses. I think there's an emotional problem. And these people are, in some sense, struggling to justify how they came into such great fortune.
Well, that's sort of like a survivor guilt among the faculty. But what about the students and the white male guilt that seems to be, the badge we carry?
Yeah, that's pretty thick too. This stuff at the Duke rape case, the thing at Virginia, the accusation of that fraternity, the gang rape that turned out to be false in Rolling Stone. This stuff at Yale even recently, I'm only shocked that it's taken this long for this to come out to this degree. I saw it 20 years ago. So the white heterosexual male is the logical, easiest target. And that's just the way the game is played. And I don't see any real solution on the horizon, not in my lifetime.
Getting back to academics and your first love, you're just now launching a MOOC, a massive open online course titled Discover Don Quixote de la Mancha. Why do you consider Don Quixote the greatest book of all time?
In terms of its aesthetic power, it's just an incredibly intricate book. He spent 25 years on it. It's the Spanish Baroque. It's 1,300 pages long. It's just an epic magnum opus. I think of it as a cathedral. You go from chapter to chapter, episode to episode, and there's just something intricate and new every step of the way. Now, I think it's also one of the greatest books because of its influence on some of the most important classical liberal traditions in Western culture. We know that men like Jefferson, Bastiat, Hume, Locke were huge fans of Don Quixote. And not just fans, they didn't just read it as a pastime, they read it very, very carefully, right? They attended to its details and its messages. They understood it as anti-utopian. They understood that it advocated free markets. They understood that it was against racism. They even understood that it was a political critique of authoritarianism. So it's a hugely beautiful book, but it's also hugely important in its impact on the Western tradition.
Among his many themes, Cervantes had a complex relationship with Islam. He spent 5 years of his life as a slave in Algiers and lived in Spain during the final expulsion of the Moors. How would you characterize his views on the potential for Islam to coexist with Western civilization?
Yeah, I think this is another important aspect of Don Quixote that makes it one of these great books that everyone should read. I think of Cervantes as actually fairly liberal and relatively optimistic with regard to Islam. He did draw some pretty big lines in the sand, however, and one of the biggest ones is Islam's treatment of women. And you see that again and again in both parts of Don Quixote. Women are constantly fleeing Islam, and to the degree that, the reconquest mentality, the kind of imperialistic, colonialistic attitude of late Renaissance Spain is justified to Cervantes, and most of the times it's not. He's a harsh critic of it. But when it is justified, it's all about, to borrow a modern term, it's all about the hearts and minds of women. So, I would envision Cervantes today, if someone in Europe were to consult him, his response might be, well, let's let all the women in.
Interesting. And keep the young, aggressive males out?
And the young, aggressive males are going to be a problem. Yeah. Islam is extremely confrontational and abusive towards women. It's a core part of the Quran, and it's a problem in those cultures of North Africa and the Middle East.
Now, Eric, you can't say these things on an American university, and your first critics would be feminists. Why is that?
Yeah, you've got me now. I return to the issue of guilt, the sort of tribalism, the groupthink, the idea that academia is really now Mortal Kombat. I think the great Eric Hoffer said something about mass movement politics being all about brilliantly being able to ignore the facts. And that's what's going on. I mean, it's the only way I can explain it. For a feminist to embrace Islam is just, I think, the ultimate contradiction. And I don't know what, again, Hayek is a Nazi, and Islam is somehow a fellow traveler with feminism. I just don't get it.
It's an amazing inversion that's taken place in the United States, but you seem to have found refuge in Guatemala. Eric, thanks so much for being on the show. Hey,
thank you, Bill. It was fun.
That was Eric Graf from the University of Francisco Marroquin, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. That wraps up our show for this week. Please join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.